Hey there, welcome. My name is Dr. Greg Celaya, and today we have a very special guest. We have Dr. John Purcell, and he's head of vegetable seed R&D for Bayer Corporation. And before we get started, go ahead and hit that subscribe button down below, and also hit the bell to be notified of any future videos. And make sure to leave a comment so we can have a conversation. So prior to working for Bayer, were you a Monsanto
Yeah, so I was Monsanto Legacy, and then prior to that, I was with the USDA, U.S. Department for Agriculture. Yeah.
And so being with Monsanto, were you with Monsanto until the merger happened and now you're Bayer, or did you
That's
come
right.
over before that?
Yep, that's right. So I came on board with the Bayer Monsanto merger acquisition. Yeah.
And so, I know there's certain things you can and can't talk about at this point in time, but how was it to work for Monsanto versus Bayer?
It's funny because people ask me that a lot, and I said maybe it's partly because I'm a scientist, and Bayer has incredible record of innovation in science. We were like maybe an hour into our first meeting together, and it was hard to tell who was from Legacy Monsanto and who was from Legacy Bayer, because there's a bunch of science nerds, right? And we're all talking science. We're all excited about what we're going to do. And that's what's been really cool about it from an R&D perspective is we really have a great interaction and a great commitment to helping farmers grow crops more sustainably. And Bayer had a very similar vision. And if you start with core values aligned, then the rest, organizationally, I think there's difference. German company, U.S. company, et cetera, et cetera. But when you start with core values that are aligned, it's easy to get through the rest. And so for me, it's actually been wonderful. And I think the colleagues from Bayer have been incredibly welcoming. And I think for us, it's fun because, as I was talking earlier about tools, there's a lot more tools now we can use. That Monsanto was really strong on genetics. Bayer had great biologicals and crop protection. So now it's all together in one place. We can really think about those integrated solutions and how do we leverage all this, including the digital platforms that the companies had to think about how do you manage all those tools. But it's been fun. And I got to say, it's the science is great and the innovation is great. And for all of us that are make their living doing science, it's a fun place to be.
Yeah, I think part of the people I'm talking to, they are really concerned with GMOs. They're concerned with glyphosate, the whole Monsanto hatred, conspiracy theorist type of scenario. And that's where a lot of them go. That's kind of why I wanted to have you on, to show that you may not be hearing the whole story from that side. Seeing where you've come from. And there was another gentleman that was at the conference who I think he mentioned he was a organic farmer, then turned scientist.
Yeah, and that's right. So Carl Jones is on my leadership team, and I think that's what's fun and what I enjoy, because there was always many cases of stigma, right? Oh, Monsanto, and it's certain expectations people had. But then once you start talking with people, like when Carl would share his story about he was an organic farmer and moved to that. And I know for me, I talk about, how I love working with my brother on his family-owned ranch that I'm a part of. I think what happens is people recognize, oh my gosh, we actually have some common interests. We actually have some common values that we share. So let's have a real conversation. Let's get past kind of the noise and have a real conversation about food and agriculture. And that's what I love about it. I always take it as a compliment when people say, "Oh, you're not what I expected." And I don't know what they expected, but I always take it as kind of a compliment. But I think when you get it down on a human to human level, you can actually have a real conversation. And that's what we need to do. Greg, there's so many challenges right now in food production. We need to have real conversations about what's really happening and how can we bring innovation to help address some of those challenges.
Yeah, and that's great. That's why I wanted to talk to you, because you were a lot of fun. I mean, you weren't your normal scientist that reciting a bunch of numbers and doing different things. It was a great presentation, and afterwards the conversation was good. And not only do you know your stuff, but you're a lot of fun to talk to. So, how do you service people that are okay with GMOs versus not, and be good to both? Do you see where I'm going with that?
I do, and I think I always try to frame it up, because there is definitely a certain stigma people attach to GMOs. And I start with a couple different things. One is I try to get them to understand and growers that choose to use GMOs, why are they doing it? Because in many cases they're very committed. They are committed to sustainability, committed to how do I have a production method that I really can utilize and makes sense for my operation while maintaining my soil and all these. So I start with, why are people using? Well, It used to be they were spraying, for example, insecticides. Now they have the Bt gene inserted into the plant to protect itself. And in fact, that same gene is in the Bts that's sprayed on organic agriculture. All we've done is taken the gene out of the bacteria and inserted it in the plant. But because it's a GMO, people think, oh my gosh. But when you say, well, actually that same active agent has been used in organic agriculture for over 50 years. And they say, oh, really? I didn't know that. Or this is why farmers like to use it. The other thing I try to talk about, and it gets a little complicated for people, is there's tremendous genetic diversity out there. And when you sequence two different varieties of tomatoes, you realize, oh my gosh, there's a tremendous amount of change. People tend to think that a genome is a genome and it hasn't changed for hundreds of years and it's the same. It's not. There's a lot of different mutations, a lot of different variation, a lot of things happening naturally. And then when you look at techniques like GMOs, you're actually making one specific insertion that's highly studied and examined. But in many cases, you're never going to get past that. And that's where, when it comes to, especially on fresh produce, I'll be honest with you, it helps us that they're not GMOs, because it's just hard to even have the conversation because there isn't a great scientific understanding. There isn't a great understanding of genetics and how GMOs fit into that. And it's hard to even get past that because there's such, the hands-on, oh my gosh, GMOs, to even get past that conversation. The 2 points I always try to hit is, look, it's a tool, it's a technology that's very valuable for some growers who choose to use it. And the second is, think about, we've been breeding crops for thousands of years, and there's a lot of changes in there. And GMOs are actually a very specific change that is made in that genome. But it's a tough one, Greg, because I think for a lot of people, it's a non-starter, right? And so it does help in the vegetable world that sweet corn is a GMO, and there's a GMO sweet corn, I should say, that's available. Squash, and then papaya is a fruit, but that's about it. Everything else is done through advanced breeding. But at least it takes it off the table, because for some people, you'll never get past that GMO label.
So it's even hard to go further into GMOs because of the stigma it brings and what people believe. So what do you have? You've got corn, you've got soybean, right? You've got papaya. What else?
On the big row crops, most of the big row crops are, and it's not. There's a reason why 80-90% of growers on those big field row crops use GMOs, because they have tremendous benefits for them. They really enjoy. They really like the advantages they bring, and it gives them more sustainable practices that they employ. But stigma is just really great on fresh produce crops. For fresh produce, in our case, we've got papaya and sweet corn, small piece of our portfolio. The big, it's not just on GMOs. There's another challenge, which is interesting. It's not just the consumer side or the societal acceptance. There's actually the regulatory piece, because it's expensive to develop new varieties of vegetables. But we're talking, we launch 125 plus products a year, and our R&D spend is about the same, 120 million a year. So about $1 million a year you can do as a rough estimate. On GMOs, for an individual GMO product, it's $100 million development cost, with almost 30 million of that being just regulatory, because of all the regulatory approvals, all the safety tests, everything that's happened. So for vegetables, you never have enough acres to be able to repay the cost of development. Plus, if you look at a crop like corn, huge numbers of acres in the U.S., Argentina, Brazil. So if you're going to cultivate in those, you need cultivation approvals. You can justify the cost of developing a GMO. But for tomatoes, we have tomatoes in 100 different countries. You'd never get through the regulatory. You'd never get paid back, even though at the grower level, having insect protection would be a great thing. Having virus protection, another GMO trait, would be a great thing. So agronomically, it makes sense. But from a regulatory perspective, from a cost of development perspective, the math doesn't work, let alone the societal acceptance perspective.
Interesting. I think one of the things that most people have a problem on that aspect is, and correct me if I'm wrong, you would be the guy to know, but with a GMO crop, you can spray glyphosate on a week prior to harvesting to take care of the weed issue. And it's not necessarily affecting the crop, but you may have residue in the produce itself and runoff and all the rest of that stuff.
We got to remember that there isn't any Roundup ready produce. So in that case, you're not doing it, because remember, it's only in the in corn, soybean. Now sweet corn, but you also have what they call spray windows, which you cannot spray you have to have an interval before any spray. And this isn't just GMO stuff, it's any crop. There's intervals when you can spray and how much prior to harvest you have to spray. So there are regulatory systems in place, not just for spraying GMO crops, but spraying insecticides or fungicide, all that. There are defined intervals. You cannot spray after this date as you get closer to harvest to reduce those residue levels. So all of that is regulated on when you can actually do it. But for most of the acres on GMO crops, they're going into commodity and feed like that. But again, there's interval sprays on when they can actually spray as far as harvest, as far as how far away from harvest time it has to be.
How usually close is that? I mean, I don't want to get into the whole Roundup thing because I know you guys probably can at this point in time.
Yeah, we can. No, it did depend. And like I say, this is all dictated by the regulatory authorities based on the half-life, based on the residue levels, et cetera. So it would be nonsense to give you a number because, in fact, it's by chemistry, by crop, by harvest. So, but you can go online and look at these spray intervals that are insured by how late you could spray in it. But every crop is different, every chemistry is different, but it's based on basically how long you expect that chemistry to be there, what the residue levels will be, and then what the safe level is as far as a residue level. I'm not a regulatory expert, but I just know from our spray regimes, we have to, that's what the regulations say. And after a certain date, you have to back up from when you're going to harvest, back up that number of days before you, not just GMOs, like I say, any kind of application you make on a crop, which makes sense, right? I mean, it's all based on the science.
Yeah, it makes sense. One question I have is that, different countries, like, for example, the EU versus the US, has different residue amounts that they allow in food. And why is that so if the science is so clear?
Well, I think, the science is clear, but I think some of it is just how much of a safety margin do you want, right? And so, I'll let the regulators talk about that. But I think in any case, as long as it's science-based, that's what all companies look for. And yeah, there are differences between regions, but there is also a lot of work that tries to establish global international standards too. So you don't have this mishmash of what's actually based on the science. And I'm sure there are differences region to region, but there are entire bodies, international bodies, who do nothing but look at what are the safe kind of residue levels, what are safe to spray levels and all that, try to get some consistency region to region.
Yeah, it was interesting because at the sports conference, I kind of raised my hand and asked a question, and it was, what was Bayer thinking from a perspective of losses, so to speak, when they acquired Monsanto? And the answer I thought was really, really kind of interesting, and it was straight up. It's like, you know what? We looked at the science. The science doesn't back that it chose to cause any problems, and therefore we made our move. And we thought society would back the science, but maybe not so.
And that's always a challenge. There's oftentimes a disconnect, right? The data tells you one thing, the science tells you one thing, but that's the reality of how not just agriculture, but every field has to deal with is we know the science, and you have to have faith in the science. That's what gives you the data you need to make the good decisions. But you also recognize that there are societal influences on any decision that's made. And in some government entities, it's more political than others. The ones that there's strict science-based assessment on safety, obviously that's the world you're most comfortable with because it's a more defined world in which you're functioning.
Do you feel comfortable talking about how that product actually works?
What's that?
The glyphosate, what it does, what protein?
I'm really not an expert, to be honest with you. I'm a veg guy, so I'm probably not an expert.
All right, so let's not go down that rabbit hole.